The noisy promos for Beyond the Gates only reveal a distorted slice of the story. Leslie becoming a laughingstock when the affair between Vernon and Sharon at a seedy motel is exposed in front of all of Fairmont Crest. But the real story began long before that moment, in the slow build-up beneath the polished steel gates, in the years Leslie spent on the fringes of Dupree family parties, in the bitterness of watching Anita, Vernon, and the entire DRI clan be respected while she herself was only ever accepted because of her money, never for who she really was. For Leslie, Fairmont Crest was not a community, but a stage where she always had to perform the role of the upstart, proving herself with checks, donations, sponsorships, and that strained smile she wore every time she walked into the club. She knew those looks all too well, half wary, half contemptuous, as if she were a social accident wrapped in designer labels. That is why the moment she saw Vernon at that motel, in a grubby setting utterly at odds with the image of the model husband the town had always praised, Leslie didn't just see an opportunity. She saw a weapon. The motel where Eva and her mother were living had long been an eyesore in Fairmont Crest's eyes, a place branded as dirty and low, somewhere people walked past quickly, eyes averted, only to whisper about it later whenever they needed an example of falling in status. Leslie often drove past, feeling both scorn and a confused, nagging curiosity about why she even cared. That day, she pulled over just to grab a quick cigarette, trying to choke down the resentment that had risen in her chest after yet another community council meeting where Anita was praised like some kind of heroine. And then, by chance, she saw Vernon walk into the motel lobby. Right after him came Sharon, the event planner everyone knew was working closely with Anita on the Winterfest plans. They didn't share any overtly intimate gestures, but seeing them arrive at the same time, at a place the town viewed as a den of sin, was enough to trigger every old wound festering inside Leslie. She didn't see a business meeting. She saw the hypocrisy of people held up as moral examples. She didn't see Vernon planning a surprise for his wife. She saw a sanctimonious man stepping into the shadows with another woman. In Leslie's mind, that single piece instantly locked into the picture she had always wanted to believe. That the Dupree family was nothing but an act. That the praise heaped on Anita and Vernon was fake. That the people who had made her feel small were just as filthy as anyone else. From that moment on, Leslie started convincing herself that this wasn't just her imagination. She clenched her phone, snapped a few blurry photos through her car window, and her heart pounded not just from shock, but from a kind of pent-up excitement. Holding someone else's secret made her feel powerful. For so long, power in Fairmont Crest had belonged to people like Anita, Vernon, and the DRI family, while she, despite inheriting Barbara's trust, remained the outsider clawing for a place at the table. Now, for the first time, she felt she held something they might actually fear. And when someone has been consumed by the feeling of being looked down on for too long, the truth itself stops mattering. What matters is the story they can spin from scattered fragments of reality. Leslie took the grainy photos, fused them with the town's prejudice against the motel, layered her contempt for their hypocrisy over it, and from there she constructed what, in her own eyes, was the perfect piece of visual evidence. The rumors didn't begin with open anger, but with a sugary, fake concern. Leslie chose to approach people one by one, wearing a worried expression, dropping half-finished sentences, and acting as if she were trying to protect Anita rather than destroy her marriage. She confided in a few women's group members that there were things they ought to know if they truly cared about Anita, emphasizing that she didn't want to believe it herself but had seen Vernon with her own eyes at a place he should never have been, especially in the company of another woman. She carefully omitted that the woman was Sharon, the event planner, and instead hinted at a well-dressed woman whose polished appearance clashed starkly with the run-down motel. Those who already harbored prejudice let their imaginations fill in the gaps. Leslie never used the word affair, but she laced her comments with phrases like inappropriate, not during working hours, and Anita would be heartbroken if she knew, stringing them together, just so to create exactly the effect she wanted. Inside, she justified it as exposing their lies, forcing the town to face the truth. But deep down, her real motive was to drag Anita and Vernon down into the mud so no one could ever look down on her again. Meanwhile, Vernon, the man who always appeared in public as calm and devoted to the community, had no idea that each secret meeting with Sharon was laying another brick in the house of rumor Leslie was building. All he thought about was preparing the perfect gift for Anita at Winterfest, a grand romantic gesture planned in minute detail so meticulously that he felt compelled to hide it even from those closest to them. Every time he stepped into that motel, where Sharon had rented a small room to rehearse, test the lighting and sound, and mock up the stage, Vernon felt an instinctive discomfort with the surroundings. But he kept telling himself that the end goal justified the means. He had helped people escape lives tied to shameful places more than once, had funded projects to revitalize poor neighborhoods, and he was painfully aware that him entering a shabby motel didn't match the public image he had spent years carefully constructing. Even so, it never crossed his mind that this one choice, combined with the poisoned gaze of someone who had always felt shut out, could be enough to wreck the reputation he had built over a lifetime. Sharon was no better off. As an ambitious event planner, she saw this collaboration with Anita as her biggest chance yet to cement her place in the region's luxury events
circuit.
She threw herself into the work with professional zeal and passion, but she never forgot she was an outsider, that she didn't truly belong to that wealthy world. She accepted the motel as a secret rehearsal space because it was cheap and discreet, but somewhere in the back of her mind, the risk of scandal always nagged at her. When she started noticing strange looks from Fairmont Crest residents who happened to pass by, unease crept in deeper. Still, the pressure of finishing the surprise on time kept her silent. She staked her professional reputation on the hope that a flawless performance would erase any lingering doubts. Sharon had no idea that once Leslie twisted the story into a scandal, all her professionalism would be swallowed by prejudice and prurient curiosity about people's private lives. Anita was the last to hear the rumors, but the one they cut deepest. She had long been the face of kindness and generosity in Fairmont Crest, the one who organized charity drives, the one whose resilience after old hardships had made her a local symbol of strength. Behind that public image was a heart already scarred, a woman who had seen infidelity in other seasons of her life and knew all too well the weight of the word affair. When veiled hints about Vernon and a mysterious woman at a cheap motel reached her, Anita couldn't just shrug them off. She spent sleepless nights looking at the husband who still wrapped his arms around her every morning, while a storm of anger and fear churned inside her. She found herself at a brutal crossroads. If she believed the rumors, every year they had shared, every time Vernon had quietly supported her community work from the shadows, would collapse into rubble. But if she dismissed them, she risked being branded a fool, a woman too blind to see betrayal. In the end, after weighing it over and over, Anita decided to trust what she had seen with her own eyes over the years. Vernon's dedication, the nights he stayed up worrying over a neighbor's misfortune, the many times he had simply listened when she needed someone beside her. She chose silence, no confrontation, no explosion, maintaining a calm image before the community. That choice, however, was anything but peaceful. Every step she took into the hospital, every handshake from a resident, might be laced with scrutiny. Anita became a prisoner of her own decision to trust, both protecting her marriage and torturing herself with the possibility that she might be wrong. Somewhere else, Eva was cornered in a moral dead end. She lived with her mother in that despised motel, carrying both class shame and a debt of gratitude to Leslie, who had stepped in a few times when they were on the verge of being thrown out of the only shelter they had. When the rumors about Vernon and Sharon exploded, Eva was one of the very few who knew more than anyone that those meetings were nothing more than rehearsals for a romantic plan. She had overheard snatches of conversation about music, lighting, and the exact moment when Vernon wanted to drop to one knee at Winterfest to reaffirm his love for Anita. Eva understood that if the truth came out, Vernon and Sharon's reputations could be salvaged. But she also understood that she and her mother would be the first targets of Leslie's wrath. Leslie had used her influence to help them stay at the motel, in exchange for a wordless expectation of loyalty. If Eva broke the silence, if she admitted she knew the truth and that Leslie had used the motel as a backdrop to her scheme against the Duprees, everything they had might vanish. The fear of being tossed out on the street and being branded a traitor by both Fairmont Crest and those who shared her circumstances choked her every time she thought about telling the truth. The closer Winterfest came, the more the town's atmosphere felt charged with static. Poolside brunches turned into strategic war rooms. On one side were those secretly hoping to watch Vernon be publicly humiliated, seeing it as proof that nobody in this community was as noble as they claimed. They reveled in the fantasy of the Dupree reputation shattering, opening the door to a new social power shuffle where those who knew how to exploit scandal could rise. On the other side were those who remembered Vernon's quiet acts of help, remembered how Anita had arranged a funeral for someone with no family, remembered actions that did not make it into glossy photos. They wanted to believe in goodness, but the image of Vernon and Sharon at the motel, as retold by Leslie with that poisonously sympathetic tone, was a thorn in their faith. The town was split between the desire to protect its heroes and the dark thrill of seeing them fall. On the night before Winterfest, the motel lights still burned late. Sharon was fine-tuning the last details. Vernon was rehearsing the script in his head. Eva stood in the hallway, her back against peeling walls, clutching her phone with Anita's number glowing on the screen, but unable to press call. Across the gates, Leslie stood at her own window, staring out at Fairmont Crest, watching the lit windows of the Dupree estate, imagining the moment when the entire community would turn and laugh in Anita's face. In that fantasy, she didn't see herself as the villain. She cast herself as the truth-teller, the one bold enough to expose what others were too cowardly to face. That image kept her awake, but it was an excited sleeplessness. Yet beneath that thin layer of false confidence, a small corner of her mind whispered a question she refused to answer. What if this was all a misunderstanding? What if Vernon truly was innocent? Instead of facing that possibility, she smothered it with layers of logic. That genuinely good men would never place themselves in such ambiguous situations, that if Vernon had nothing to hide, he would have said everything from the start. She conveniently ignored that she herself was living off partial truths retold in whatever way benefited her most. When Winterfest finally began, Fairmont Crest put on its most dazzling mask. Glittering lights, gentle music, expensive gowns, flawless tuxedos. But beneath the finery was a nearly pathological anticipation. Every eye fixed on the stage was not just waiting for a performance, but for a fall. Anita walked into that space wearing a carefully practiced serenity, each step a private battle between love and pride. Vernon stood behind the curtain, weighed down by a secret he had believed was nothing more than a romantic surprise, now entangled in rumors he had only heard through insinuating glances. Sharon was more tense than ever, not just because of professional pressure, but because of the gnawing sense that her entire life could veer into darkness if things went wrong. Eva slipped through the crowd, feeling as if every light in the room bore down on her, knowing better than anyone else that the moment to come would decide whether the truth would finally be restored to the innocent. When Vernon finally stepped out, the big screen behind him lit up. Spotlights illuminated a montage he and Sharon had painstakingly assembled. Images of Anita's community work, milestones in her life, intercut with words of gratitude and love that Vernon had written. The crowd fell completely silent at first, because there was no scandal, no damning evidence of infidelity, only a husband standing before his wife, the world shrinking to fit inside her eyes. With each passing second, some people began to feel ashamed for how quickly they had believed a story they'd only heard secondhand. Others desperately searched for flaws, wondering if this was all a hastily staged cover-up after being caught. Leslie, standing among them, could feel cold shivers running down her spine. The plan she'd considered flawless suddenly felt shaky. All she really had were a few blurry photos and a pile of embellished retellings, while in front of her was a radiant display of love, rewarded with thunderous applause. But even as the true purpose of those motel meetings became clearer, the stain of the rumor did not vanish so easily. In the darker corners of the hall, small groups began murmuring. Some insisted Vernon had simply been quick-witted, turning a shady relationship into a romantic spectacle to save face. Others quietly glanced over at Leslie, recalling how she had described what she had witnessed, and started questioning her motives. A few members of the clubs and committees Leslie had bought her way into with generous sponsorships began reassessing their position. They understood that staying aligned with her might drag them into similar storms in the future. Private meetings were quickly scheduled after the festival to discuss whether Leslie's roles in certain projects should be temporarily frozen, under the polite pretext of reviewing how sensitive information is handled. For Leslie, the night did not end with an immediate, dramatic expulsion from the community, but with a slow, creeping sense of fracture. She could feel that trust had thinned in people's eyes, that handshakes had grown colder, that polite smiles seemed even more hollow now. Her anger did not lessen. It shifted. Rather than accepting that she might have been wrong, she clung to the idea that everyone had simply been swayed by a cheap emotional show. She told herself she had been right about them all along. A community obsessed with appearances, ready to forgive anything as long as it was wrapped in stage lights and polished speeches. That bitterness only hardened her resolve to find real proof, even if it meant trampling boundaries she once thought she would never cross. Meanwhile, Anita returned home from Winterfest with a tangle of emotions. She had been celebrated, comforted, and held up as a lucky woman with a devoted husband. Yet somewhere in the shadows of her heart, the question of how everything had been so badly misconstrued still haunted her. She wondered whether she was living among people who were too easily led by images and gossip rather than by their own lived experiences. With someone's true character, Vernon, though relieved that his surprise hadn't imploded, could not shake the fact that his integrity had been tossed around like a public toy. He began looking around with a newfound wariness, understanding that even the smallest misstep in how he presented himself could turn him into a target. Eva went back to the motel, walking down the hallway where it had all begun, carrying the guilt of not having spoken up earlier. She asked herself whether, if she had been braver, Anita might have suffered less in the days before Winterfest, whether Sharon could have been spared those nerve-wracking moments, whether the whole town might have been less mired in speculation. But she also knew that in a world where someone like Leslie could decide who stayed and who was cast out, simple moral choices didn't really exist. She was no saint, just a girl trying to keep a roof over her and her mother's heads. In the end, one question still hung in the air over Fairmont Crest after Winterfest. What would this town ultimately put more faith in, the goodness they had personally witnessed, or the visual evidence fashioned from fragments and used to feed one woman's hunger for power? The truth had been exposed, but the rumor remained like a stubborn stain on the town's collective memory. Some people silently apologized to Anita in their hearts, but no one stood up to admit they had believed Leslie's story. And Leslie, even as she faced the prospect of being sidelined from some of the organizations and clubs she had once bought her way into, had no intention of stopping. Cornered, she only grew more dangerous, because someone stuffed full of bitterness and the feeling of being perpetually looked down on will always be willing to burn down the entire stage, as long as, in the fire, the people who once stood above her are dragged down too. If the rumor is ultimately proven false, will Leslie be expelled from the organizations, clubs, and social circles she once bought off to build her power? How will the Fairmont Crest community see her after all this, as a wounded, unhealed victim, or as a venomous snake disguised in the skin of someone who has been hurt?